Yo soy Iraís Vázquez, analista técnica senior de Climate Bonds Initiative y estaré acompañándolos como anfitriona y moderadora. A continuación, algunos recordatorios para tener un seminario fluido. Contamos con traducción simultánea de inglés a español. Debajo de la pantalla, en la barra de herramienta de Zoom, encontrarán el símbolo de un mundo donde podrán dar clic y seleccionar su idioma de preferencia. Si tienen alguna pregunta, comentario, no duden en escribirlo en la caja de preguntas y con gusto lo responderemos al finalizar la presentación. Hoy tenemos como invitada especial a mi colega experta en taxonomías, Bridget, quien nos compartirá su conocimiento acerca del desarrollo y uso de taxonomías verdes y sociales alrededor del mundo. Bridget es la jefa de taxonomías de CBI, donde supervisa todo el trabajo relacionado con las taxonomías de finanzas verdes y sostenibles en todo el mundo. Ahora vamos a presentarles lo que es la presentación que tenemos preparada para el día de hoy. También les comento que Bridget, dentro de los proyectos en los que ha colaborado, incluyen la taxonomía de Common Ground o suelo común a través de la Plataforma Internacional de Finanzas Sostenibles, así como la taxonomía de ASEAN, Chile y otros procesos de desarrollo de taxonomías. Ha formado parte del equipo de Climate Bonds Initiative desde el 2012 como jefa del equipo de inteligencia de mercados, donde encabezó la base de datos de bonos verdes y publicaciones de investigaciones clave, como la serie de informes sobre el estado de mercado. También fue jefa del equipo de Asia-Pacífico en el 2019 y gerente de contenido y producción del 2020 al 2021, donde supervisó la publicación de emisiones clave de bonos climáticos a través de diferentes equipos. Bridget está basada en Sydney, Australia. Bienvenida, Bridget. Bueno, y pues sin más, vamos a comenzar con nuestra presentación. Siguiente slide, por favor. Bueno, primero quisiera yo introducirles y presentarles para todas aquellas que no conocen del todo quién es Climate Bonds y el trabajo que hacemos alrededor del mundo. Pues quisiera yo contarles que Climate Bonds Initiative es una organización global centrada en los inversionistas que movilizan los mercados de capital de deuda para impulsar soluciones climáticas, ya sean de mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero o de adaptación y resiliencia a las amenazas del cambio climático. En este sentido, CBI apoya las inversiones de largo plazo para acelerar las transacciones hacia y lo que es la transición hacia una economía baja en carbono, a través de instrumentos financieros etiquetados como verdes, como pueden ser, por ejemplo, los bonos verdes. Y esto lo hace Climate Bonds a través de 3 iniciativas. La primera, que es el desarrollo de mercados internacionales verdes. Como pueden ver en nuestro esquema, tenemos pues equipos regionales alrededor del mundo. Nuestras headquarters están basados en Londres, en el Reino Unido, pero les comento que tenemos equipos regionales alrededor del mundo, específicamente en Latinoamérica. Tenemos equipos físicos en Brasil, en Colombia y en México, a los cuales les brindamos asistencias técnicas, capacitaciones como este webinar, workshops y demás. Y también hacemos publicaciones sobre el estado del mercado financiero de las finanzas verdes alrededor del mundo y también en las diversas regiones. La segunda iniciativa es el estándar y certificación de instrumentos verdes. CBI es una organización pionera en cuanto a la certificación de instrumentos etiquetados como verdes, es decir, otorgamos la certificación a aquellos instrumentos que cumplen con los criterios de mitigación y adaptación de Climate Bonds y que están alineados a nuestro estándar. Es importante decir que el estándar de Climate Bonds también está alineado al estándar de ICMA, de los principios de bonos verdes. Y nuestra tercera iniciativa es la base de datos, análisis e investigación de mercados. Esto lo realiza nuestro equipo de inteligencia de mercados. Y bueno, pues ustedes pueden encontrar estadísticas sobre la situación de las finanzas, específicamente los bonos verdes en el mundo. Estos datos y estas estadísticas las pueden encontrar en nuestra página de internet. Siguiente, por favor. Ahora bien, como el día de hoy vamos a hablar sobre taxonomías, primero quisiera yo platicarles qué es una taxonomía y específicamente qué es la taxonomía de CBI. Se puede decir que es una guía de activos y proyectos para afrontar las amenazas del cambio climático, para aportar a la mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero, y esta es una herramienta para inversionistas, para gobiernos, emisores, municipios y demás usuarios del sector financiero, para ayudarlos a comprender cuáles son las inversiones clave para transitar hacia una economía baja en carbono. Y surge esta taxonomía de la necesidad identificada por parte de los inversionistas, los cuales han manifestado su interés en mitigar los impactos negativos del cambio climático. Sin embargo, han expresado que no cuentan con las suficientes herramientas que les garanticen que sus inversiones tengan un impacto significativo. Y en este sentido, los inversionistas necesitan la orientación de expertos y basado en ciencia sobre qué inversiones son parte de una economía baja en carbono, esto para facilitar la toma de sus decisiones. Siguiente, por favor. Ahora bien, ¿cuáles son los objetivos de una taxonomía? Podemos decir que dentro de varios de los objetivos está crear un sistema de clasificación uniforme y armonizado que genere una base común de conocimiento y de vocabulario para todos los usuarios del sector financiero. Esto nos va a ayudar a evitar lo que es la fragmentación del mercado y a su vez también nos protege contra el conocido lavado verde o greenwashing. Asimismo, también una taxonomía nos va a ayudar a proporcionar bases para la creación de medidas de política pública, algunas otras normas, equivalencias e incentivos en el mercado financiero verde. Siguiente, por favor. Y bueno, en esta lámina lo que les podemos mostrar, como yo les decía, es ¿qué es la taxonomía de Climate Bonds? ¿No? Ya les comentaba yo que es una guía de activos y proyectos alineados con las metas del Acuerdo de París, ¿no? Con el poner como un máximo de calentamiento global el 1.5 grados, por lo cual podemos decir que la taxonomía de Climate Bonds es una taxonomía verde. En este sentido, es una herramienta para identificar las inversiones clave para una economía baja en carbono, ya se los había yo mencionado, y esta tiene un enfoque basado en ciencia, es decir, que fue desarrollada por un grupo de expertos técnicos, tanto de la industria como del sector científico, lo cual nos proporciona recursos de definiciones verdes comunes para el uso de los usuarios del sector financiero y de los mercados. Lo que nos muestra este esquema es la distribución dentro de los sectores de la economía, pues Climate Bonds ha desarrollado lo que son los criterios de la elegibilidad para los sectores que vemos aquí en la pantalla. Por ejemplo, tenemos energía, transporte, agua, edificaciones, el sector AFOLU, que es uso de suelo, industria, desechos y lo que son las tecnologías de información. Para cada uno de estos sectores podemos ver que Climate Bonds cuenta con diversas subactividades, las cuales etiqueta de acuerdo al desarrollo de los criterios de elegibilidad. ¿Esto qué quiere decir? Que, por ejemplo, si tiene una etiqueta de este círculo púrpura que vemos al lado derecho de cada subactividad, quiere decir que Climate Bonds ya cuenta con los suficientes criterios de elegibilidad para determinar si esta actividad es verde o no puede ser considerada verde. Después tenemos aquellos criterios con la etiqueta ámbar, lo cual quiere decir que los criterios aún están en desarrollo. ¿Y por qué aún están en desarrollo? Porque podemos decir que una taxonomía es un instrumento, una herramienta viva que se encuentra en continuo desarrollo. A medida en la que contemos con mayor información, investigación y desarrollo, podemos desarrollar nosotros como Climate Bonds lo que son los criterios de elegibilidad, tanto de mitigación de gases de efecto invernadero como de adaptación y resiliencia a las amenazas del cambio climático. Y por último tenemos la etiqueta gris, que quiere decir que estos criterios aún están por comenzar. Entonces, dentro de los criterios con los que ya contamos con lo que son posible, que ya pueden ser certificables bajo el estándar de Climate Bonds. Tenemos actividades, por ejemplo, relacionadas con energías renovables, transmisión y distribución de energía eléctrica. En cuanto a transporte, tenemos transporte público, transporte privado. Agua, tenemos saneamiento, distribución y lo que son todas las infraestructura de defensa contra inundaciones. En edificios tenemos la construcción de nuevos edificios, remodelación de edificios. En AFOLU tenemos ganadería, agricultura, silvicultura y demás. En cuanto a industria, los invitamos a conocer los nuevos criterios de producción de cemento, que ya fueron lanzados a consulta pública, así como la producción de químicos básicos. Y próximamente se lanzarán los criterios relacionados con la producción de aluminio, de acero y de hierro. En cuanto a desechos, tenemos ya criterios relacionados con todo lo que es el reciclaje, todo lo que es la generación de energía a través de residuos y demás. Y en cuanto a tecnologías de información, pues tenemos lo que son actividades relacionadas con software que apoyen a la mitigación, adaptación al cambio climático o al monitoreo del mismo. Siguiente, por favor. Y bueno, finalmente para finalizar con la taxonomía de Climate Bonds, aquí únicamente les quiero comentar cómo es que se lee la taxonomía de Climate Bonds o cómo es que se usa. Y nosotros, dentro de los sectores económicos que les mostré hace un momento, y tenemos dentro de esos sectores económicos, tenemos subactividades, y cada una de estas subactividades la clasificamos por un sistema de luces de semáforo. Y les voy a poner un ejemplo. Cuando tenemos una actividad verde claro, significa que esta actividad es automáticamente compatible con la taxonomía de Climate Bonds. Y un ejemplo del sector energía serían todas esas actividades relacionadas con la generación de energía a través de fuentes renovables. Después tenemos la etiqueta ámbar, que quiere decir que son compatibles únicamente si cumplen con los criterios de elegibilidad. Y continuando con el ejemplo de energías, por ejemplo, si tenemos la generación de energía solar, uno de los criterios de elegibilidad es que el backup de este tipo de energía no exceda el 15% de energías fósiles. Y después tenemos las actividades no compatibles que se etiquetan con el color rojo, y esto quiere decir, pues eso, ¿no? Que no están alineadas con las metas del Acuerdo de París, por lo tanto no pueden ser compatibles con el estándar y la taxonomía de Climate Bonds, y estos serían, por ejemplo, todas las actividades relacionadas con energías fósiles. Y finalmente, pues tenemos la etiqueta gris, que esto quiere decir que aún se requiere más trabajo para determinar los umbrales y los criterios de elegibilidad. Bueno, esto sería todo por mi parte. Ahora le doy la palabra a mi compañera Bridget para que nos cuente sobre el desarrollo de las taxonomías internacionales. Adelante, Bridget.
Gracias, Irais, y gracias a todos. Disculpe, voy a hablar en inglés. Hoy es muy temprano en la mañana en Australia y mi español es un poquito óxido, rusty, no sé si es correcto, pero gracias a todos y voy a hablar en inglés. I'll go to the next slide, please. I'll give you an overview of the taxonomies and developments around the world. I'll try and keep an eye on the questions on the side as well, and as they come up, to answer them as we go, but otherwise we'll have quite a lot of time for questions at the end. So thank you for all of those coming in so far. Around the world, there are many taxonomies in development. You can see a map over there. Apologies, the text is quite small. But there's various colors there. There's regulation or guidance already available in blue or in draft, which is slightly lighter blue, and discussion underway is the very light green. So there's a few updates to this slide which we'll make, but there's many discussions all around the world, and that looks different. And I think I saw one of the questions coming up in the box about, are they all the same? They do look quite different. In developed markets and emerging markets, sometimes the methodology is slightly different, and the way that they put forward eligibility is slightly different. And I think the way we tend to talk about taxonomies, that is fine, particularly if there is local specificity that's being taken into account. So a lot of people are quite concerned about the fragmentation of the market, and that is a legitimate concern. We don't want 100 different definitions of green. We want them to be harmonized and what people are using the word interoperable around the world, so that they can be usable by different operators in different places. And that is a really core objective of the Climate Bonds Initiative, is to facilitate that interoperability. But they will look slightly different. In some jurisdictions, they might use the same methodology as another jurisdiction and come up with a different number. But we really want to encourage that similar metrics and similar concepts are used around the world as taxonomies develop. I'll go to the next slide, please. I'll give you an overview of some of the developments that are happening around the world. On the right, you see China. That was actually the very first taxonomy that was put forward. It wasn't called a taxonomy, it's called a catalogue, but that was put forward in 2015 and is used particularly and only in the green bond market. It is used elsewhere, but from a regulated point of view, it's only for green bonds. There are a few things that you might have heard about the China taxonomy over the years. One is that it used to include quote unquote clean coal or high efficiency coal. It doesn't include this anymore. So electricity generation from clean coal and electricity generation from gas are no longer included in the China taxonomy. And this decision was made over various iterations to align more closely with some developments happening in the rest of the world. In the European Union, there was a very long and extensive process to come up with the EU taxonomy. The first part of the regulation was put forward last year and agreed, and is accompanied by climate criteria which cover mitigation and adaptation. It's part of a broader EU sustainable finance strategy, and we like to think of it as kind of one core kind of building block around which other building blocks are based. So in particular, you have disclosure regulations, which will relate back to the EU taxonomy. And you have other types of regulation which will utilize the EU taxonomy as its definition of green. The EU also started the international platform on sustainable finance with China, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And it has its own platform, a lot of platforms around. The Platform on Sustainable Finance for the EU is the group of experts that is taking forward the EU taxonomy to look at new objectives and new areas, and they're currently still working. So it really is a work in progress. They've started and they've put forward the climate part of the taxonomy, but it is work continuing on social objectives and on other environmental objectives. In Japan, the Ministry of Environment put forward its first its guidance a few years ago to cover the green bond market. They also have some transition finance principles that were released a number of, I think 2 years ago. The intention was to develop that into a taxonomy. I'm not entirely sure where that is at the moment, and if they have decided to take that on, but we'll watch that space. Next slide, please. Looking into other parts of the world, so in ASEAN, at the COP last year, you may have seen that they also announced a taxonomy that they were putting out across for a regional taxonomy. And they, with the various central banks across the region, and they promote and to maintain an ASEAN taxonomy. The draft you might have seen is actually not yet a taxonomy. It's called one, it's not quite yet a taxonomy. It's more of a concept to try and think, if we're going to develop a very detailed taxonomy, this is how it will look, more like a roadmap. And that was put forward last year, and I think they intend to look at various consultation processes this year to develop a fully fledged taxonomy. But there are also many developments happening within ASEAN. Indonesia put forward its taxonomy just the early part of this year. Vietnam are working on a taxonomy, Singapore and others. So we yet to quite understand how they will all fit together. But I think that they will probably release more guidance on that as the ASEAN taxonomy process develops. In Chile, the roadmap for the development of a taxonomy was published in 2021, which was a comprehensive roadmap for Chile. And the process for the development is expected to start at the moment. And that has under the supervision of the Ministry of Finance. And Climate Bonds has also provided support to that, as it has to many of the other ones we've spoken about, in particular the EU platform, ASEAN taxonomy, and some of the other ones. So we'll see what happens in Chile. I have quite a strong interest in how they take forward some of the criteria that are quite important to Chile, like mining, that are not currently covered in other areas of taxonomies. Apologies for the background noise. In Canada, they are a group of experts is looking at developing a transition taxonomy that has been in development since early 2020. There's been, as you can imagine, some ups and downs along the road of developing that, and there was some publicity where certain experts didn't agree with the direction that it was going, but I think that is now well underway, and I think we expect to hear see the first draft from them in the coming months. Moving on to other parts of the world, in the next slide, I think it's going to come up in a minute. We'll start with Mexico, and I'll just wait until the slide moves on. There we go. So Mexico, quite interesting. The regulators are discussing the development of a taxonomy at the moment, but this will be much broader. Pardon me, and will focus on wider sustainable development objectives. And this is the same. I don't know if we have a slide for India here, but in India, they are also currently in development of their taxonomy, and that has been a core part of what they do. So rather than developing it in different stages, like the EU have done, starting with climate, other environmental and social, in India, they're really threading those all together into a single taxonomy, because they really believe that the social and the environment are not separate. That's very easy to do on paper, quite difficult to do in practice. So we'll see how what they put forward. In Sri Lanka, that's also underway, and we're expected to be inspired again by EU and China taxonomies, and maybe by the Common Ground taxonomy as well. Next slide, please. So rounding up the world tour of taxonomies, Colombia and Peru. In Colombia, we've seen the first draft, and that was from the Taxonomy Roundtable with the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, National Planning Department, and National Administrative Department of Statistics, and the Finance Superintendencia, and the Ministry of Finance. So there's a big group of different ministries that comprise the round table, and they're responsible for implementing and the design and the coordination of the first phase of the Green Taxonomy, which we've seen the consultation and expecting more news imminently. In Peru, the Green Finance Roadmap is a tool which the Ministry of Environment are promoting, and it works with the relevant public and private actors in the financial system. And there's just a few more flags there. There's developments happening also elsewhere around the world, which we haven't touched in detail. I'm always happy to answer questions. In Dominican Republic, in South Africa, which is actually my home. So I can, there's plenty going on there that's quite interesting. We expect something. And then the IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, it has been put out the first version of the Common Ground taxonomy, which is work between the EU and China to identify areas of commonality between the EU and China. And as this work moves forward, the intention is that it will include other taxonomies from around the world into this common ground. And I think some of they are members of the International Platform of Sustainable Finance from Latin America as well. So perhaps those will be part of the future work of the Common Ground taxonomy. And just another quick note on the Common Ground taxonomy. One of the intentions of that work is it to be used as a building block for other jurisdictions developing their taxonomy, and to use it as a resource. And so we hope that will be something that other jurisdictions can use to facilitate harmonization of taxonomies. Go into the next slide, please. So some of the considerations for the objectives of the taxonomy. And we've got a few points there. So the first is the targets, setting clear targets for selected objectives. So what are we really aiming towards for this green, social, or climate? What's the end point? Where are we trying to get to? So that then we can put forward measurements and metrics about how to get there. And those targets should be quite easy to measure. In climate, this is quite easy, or fairly easy, maybe I should say. In other environmental objectives, that is a bit more difficult. And you can think in climate, we can measure greenhouse gas emissions. In other objectives, that becomes more complex. But targets are still really important, and particularly targets for along the way. So not just the end goal, but also milestones that map out the targets along the way. The second is really strong ambition, and higher ambition than NDCs or national policies and plans, and in line with climate goals. This is a kind of conversation I have quite a lot and around how much should taxonomies be bound by the current status versus thinking about the future, and different taxonomies have taken a different approach here. For example, in South Africa, the conversation around is mostly about how to align internationally to use the taxonomy as a tool to attract international is hampering progress on the taxonomy. So there's slightly different conversations around that, but very important to have that strong ambition. The next is that we think about the science basis. So that we have a scientific approach using clear selection criteria for activities is very important, and that we utilize that rather than national policies or plans, that we have Erase, your video is stopped. Is my line, you give me the thumbs up if my line is okay. Is that all right? Yeah, okay, good. I'll move on then. So yeah, so science-based and strong ambition. And this is one of the conversations we also have a lot linked to the strong ambition, is how we designate what the taxonomy and the aim of the taxonomy is to do. And in the EU, and it's certainly not a perfect process, but in other taxonomies, the idea is to take where do we need to get to at the end, and how do we build backwards from that? So in other words, let's envisage a different world and use the taxonomy as a tool to plot out progress towards that world, rather than thinking what's possible and what's realistic in the current business as usual paradigm, and see how we can move forward. And that's kind of two different approaches. In the former, you're really thinking about we absolutely have to achieve net zero, and in the latter, you may be hampered by kind of current political paradigms. So really using the taxonomy as a forward-looking tool. International alignment, we've spoken a little bit about this already. Very important to try and have harmonization around the world and make sure that the taxonomy is usable and understandable around the world. And the last is around alignment with the SDG goals and the Paris Agreement and climate targets. So going back to the science basis, that we use international and recognized goals like SDGs as the basis for which we put forward a taxonomy. I'll go on to the next slide. So I want to save lots of time for questions, and I know I'm probably talking too much, so I'll just give you a quick overview of some of the other parts of taxonomies. So in terms of objectives around the world, you can see the table in front of you shows you some comparison between what are the objectives in climate bonds taxonomy in the EU and China, to see where there's some similarities. You can see the objectives on the left. The common objectives we see are usually kind of climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. We see conservation of resources, circular economy, pollution prevention, and also biodiversity and ecosystems. And these are, you can see how they're covered across the taxonomy. Different countries use slightly different names for things. So sometimes you can see these are blended. So for example, in China, they talk more generally about climate change response is the name of the objective, which loosely covers both climate change mitigation and adaptation, but is more weighted towards mitigation. Move on to the next slide, please. So thinking about, okay, benefits and challenges around developing taxonomies. Why are we doing this? What are the kind of benefits? So the benefits really can be to guide financial markets and particularly to facilitate international capital. And that's been quite important. They're intended to be, taxonomy is quite clear and quite public about what has been defined as green, not using proprietary or sort of black box methodologies. And that's quite important. So they're quite understandable as to how we got there, rather than using, say, a scoring framework. And so a little bit different to what's come in the market before, and tend to be developed by public authorities, or at least in collaboration with public authorities. To use it as a tool to base the market around, and support the monitoring of tracking of green investments, and really try to provide quite a strong framework around green and avoid greenwashing. So that's kind of some of the real benefits on the left-hand side, and in particular the trajectory to develop taxonomies. How did we get here to this world, and what was wrong with what went before? And primarily it was that the kind of wriggle room for greenwash, and the taxonomies have tried to narrow the definition of green to be quite specific and clear, to allow less space for interpretation, although there will always be interpretation. Some of the challenges. So it takes quite a lot of time to put one together, as maybe some of you on this call have been involved in that process, and it's long and challenging. Sometimes usability might be quite difficult as well. So you have to compromise sometimes stringency for usability, and that's definitely clear in the use cases so far. There can be some monitoring and reporting costs, and also cost of updating as well. So these are some of the challenges and benefits. And moving on to the next slide, because I can see lots of questions coming in. So I want to, I'll wrap up this part of the presentation so we can go to those. Can I move on to the next slide, please? Oh, thanks. So they have many different uses, and different countries have decided to use taxonomies differently. I mentioned China is very specific to green bonds. The EU has much wider applicability across a number of different regulations, disclosure for companies, etc. So there's different ways you can use that. In the applications, it could be green bonds, debt issuance, funding, project development, a basis for selecting projects and understanding that, but way of evaluating CapEx, OpEx, and revenue, and obviously avoiding greenwash across these. Different instruments, bonds, credits, asset-backed securities, sustainability-linked bonds, green portfolios, many different instruments that can be that can utilize taxonomies. And the different users, as I mentioned, this varies a little bit across the world. Financial institutions, project developers, bond issuers, policymakers. So in the EU, the taxonomy regulation has specific use for member states. When they develop any kind of green regulation, they have to utilize the taxonomy to back that. So that's kind of interesting way of they put that forward. Investors and asset management, of course, governments as well. I'll move on to the next slide. So the next slide covers really just some of the ways that we look at how governance of taxonomies are structured. And it is, again, a little bit different depending on where you are around the world and kind of who owns the taxonomy. But at the first level is the kind of owner or the secretariat of the taxonomy. And that is often a collaboration of public and private institutions, and they set the objective, the oversight of the development process and the review and approval. The next level down is the kind of technical level, so project coordination, the drafting, the research and that side of things. And then the next stage is the kind of technical discussion and particularly the work on sectors. So really kind of getting down into the weeds on sector documents, revision, and that type of technical work. I'll go to the next slide. So taxonomies can also incorporate the kind of quote unquote transition areas. And this is something that we hear a lot of different discussion about, and I won't get into all of it today. I often hear that transition sectors are not part of the taxonomy, but they usually are. So in the EU includes many quote unquote transition sectors like cement, steel, those type of sectors, which the thresholds are not near zero right now. They're not green right now. They are on a pathway to being green. So that is how the EU covers transition. But it's really challenging. How do we define transition, and how do we ensure that when we talk about transition finance and transition taxonomies, they are credible? And we put together some work and some research around this. And the kind of principles of a credible transition are that they are in line with a 1.5 degree trajectory in terms of climate trajectory, again established by science, that we're really looking at science goals and rather than national priorities. Offsets don't count. That's kind of an important part of how we look at decarbonising. Offsets might be a possibility for the last mile, but it's not part of the first mile of reductions. And so how we plot a pathway for decarbonisation needs to look at actual decarbonisation, and other tools can be developed in parallel. Technological viability is important, but we also need to think about the future and how to utilize and assume that certain technologies are going to come online rather than be totally constrained about that. So how we develop a pathway needs to be forward-looking and think about new technologies. And really importantly, that we focused on action and not pledges. So we can't think too much about promises for the future, but we really need to be thinking about what's happening in action right now. Then moving on to the last slide, I'll just give you a quick overview of where some of the things we expect to happen this year and in the coming months on taxonomy developments. It's a very topical space, and there's plenty happening. So the first is around kind of controversial areas. You might have heard some of the EU taxonomy developments on natural gas and nuclear, and those will be resolved later in the year, either rejected or incorporated into the taxonomy. I won't go into them now, but just to say that although the headlines often say the EU includes natural gas and nuclear, it's not quite as simple as that, and there are quite a lot of caveats for that. Even though as Climate Bonds we're not supportive of those caveats, there are quite a lot of caveats. Local taxonomies, we see many different taxonomies in the very final stages of development and are very near to be released. So I think by the time, in a few months' time, there'll be many that we can look at and compare around the world. The Common Ground taxonomy, I've mentioned the first phase came out last year, but we expect to see that developing this year, and really to try and incorporate a much broader range of jurisdictions, which I think will be very important for its use as a global tool. Transition, I just mentioned, there's a lot more discussion around transition and how to bring transition more clearly into taxonomies, and better consensus, hopefully, on what that means and how we can use a transition finance to deliver impact. And the last thing is that we really need to focus on uses and particularly usability and implementation and application this year. So we've put forward some definitions, and in some places, are these going to be workable? Are they not? We have to figure out how that's going to happen. I think that's going to be part of the conversation this year, but will really be a kind of big focus for client bonds as we move to the end of this year and next year as well. So I'll end there, noting all the different questions that are coming in, and thank you to everybody. And I don't know how you want to structure the questions, Irais, but I can kind of start to have a look at them if you like. It's hard to do the presenting and the answering questions at the same time, so I wasn't able to have a look entirely. Thanks. So I see there's a question about is it taxonomy developments identical for all countries? The same, is it same degree of evaluation or criteria? So I mentioned already that there are quite a lot of differences and different ways of thinking about eligibility around the world. So in China, there's much more of what we call a white list, or some places call a pass list. So it's more of a list of eligible technologies. These ones are eligible. If it's not on the list, it's not eligible. And it's quite focused on technologies. And you could think, and particularly manufacturing, you could think that's a big part of the Chinese economy is manufacturing. Whereas in the EU, it's more technology neutral. So they put forward a threshold. If you can meet that threshold, regardless of the taxonomy, and that's eligible. So there are differences, but there is, as I said, quite a lot of movement to try to facilitate the same types of ways, the same types of metrics, even if the criteria are slightly different. What is the difference between the CBI and the EU taxonomy? There are a few differences, and we're actually undertaking a big project at the moment to narrow those differences, and they won't be the same in all circumstances. The EU taxonomy is based on EU regulation. I think we shouldn't forget that. Its basis, and it utilizes a lot of EU regulation. Client bonds taxonomy is global, and it can't utilize EU regulation, and it shouldn't. So we try to make the client bonds taxonomy applicable internationally, and not make it as specific to a certain country. So there are some differences in that. So for example, EU utilizes the energy performance certificates in buildings and a metric called primary energy demand, which is quite EU used in the EU. But in client bonds taxonomy, we use emissions. There's a way of correlating them and calculating the difference, but we use slightly different metrics. Our intention at client bonds is for the client bonds taxonomy to be stronger or the same as the EU, so that you can always say by complying with the client bonds taxonomy, you are also in alignment with the EU, even though sometimes you might be stronger. And I think that's fine. Although, as you can imagine, that's easy to say on paper, but is quite difficult in practice. I've just spent a long period of time comparing the China taxonomy and the EU taxonomy. And in some areas, it's quite easy to say that one's stronger and that one's weaker. But in others, that's much more difficult. And the overlap is less clear. And you have to really be a very strong technical expert to understand that. So I'm going to read the last one because it's in English. I can read the third one is in Spanish. I'll get there in a sec. It'll just take me a while for my brain to work at this time in the morning. So a question about countries where taxonomies are well established. Has analysis been included on their investment impact? It's difficult to say, and I'm always a little bit wary about investment impact studies, because I've seen some of them, and sometimes the methodology and the metrics used are kind of dubious, maybe is the best way to say that. So I'm a little bit wary of that, of trying to draw conclusions. I think what we also, at client bonds, we like to try and see the forest from the trees. So in other words, has the as the definitions in China, are they improving over time, like the exclusion of clean coal, and are the projects growing over time, and is the green bond market is it facilitating a strong and growing green bond market? And I think the answer to those questions is yes, and that has flow-on effects. So we see kind of a really large and rapidly growing and strong green bond market that is aligned with kind of international expectations and science as having a big impact on the cost of capital and the flow of finance to green projects. And that cycle isn't overnight. That cycle can take some time. And it's difficult to measure along the way. But that's the theory of change for the green bond markets. And it's a bit less linear than a taxonomy means more investment impact. It's a little bit less linear than that. I'm not so sure if there have been any exact studies on that, and I can have a look around to see about that. But that would be my kind of general theory, is that we try not to get too wrapped up in that that paradigm, even though it is important. What else have we got on the? East, did you want to come in at all as well? I'll just hop in, otherwise I'll just chat.
No, muchísimas gracias, Bridget. De verdad, súper interesante toda la información que nos comparte sobre el desarrollo de taxonomías en diversas latitudes, cómo es el proceso de gobernanza para desarrollar una taxonomía, así como la importancia de una taxonomía de transición y qué es lo que podemos esperar en los próximos años. Pues más que nada, ahora yo quisiera preguntarte también, nos suelen preguntar comúnmente, ¿cuáles son los principales retos para desarrollar una taxonomía de common ground? Recuerdo que nos mencionaste sobre el desarrollo de esta taxonomía y bueno, nos suelen preguntar mucho esto.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of technical challenges from the starting point. So in the EU and China in particular, the taxonomies were developed at different times using completely different starting points. So the China taxonomy started off as a one-page A4 document. None of us ever saw that, but Ma Jun at the People's Bank of China always says that anecdote, that it started off as a one-page list of these things are green, and it's obviously developed now into many pages. But you can see that it was iterative and not formally based on, say, an industrial code like IPSF or NACE, like the EU. So the EU is based on let's look at the whole economy and try to think about green things across the whole economy, and applications for cement and steel. And the China approach was slightly different. It was more like, let's think about what we need to manufacture and produce that's green. Let's list those and really facilitate finance into those. So they have different starting points that makes them quite difficult to map. And now as taxonomies develop, that challenge is much less so. So for example, most taxonomies being developed now utilize an industrial code as a starting point, like IPSF, like NACE, those codes. And so that makes things much easier just to map and start off. And so so that's one kind of challenge, is just trying to start off, how do we compare them. The experience between EU and China also was that the starting point with China was to try to avoid harm, to really think, okay, they have big problems, particularly with pollution and some of these areas, and how do we avoid those big problems? Whereas the EU paradigm was substantial contribution to how do we contribute substantially to a goal. And so those are two different ways of looking at things, and so you get different outcomes. And in particular, the China focus is to try and utilize regulations and industrial codes and to enforce those. So they have a number of industrial codes, and now to try and have another tool to enforce those locally. And so that is a slightly different way of looking at things. So there are some challenges, but I think we found that there are also plenty of similarities and ways to overcome these, using different methodologies. Once you have a clear mapping, then you can much more easily compare them, and so that's the work we've done. And I think we often joke that starting with the EU and China was kind of the hardest work was done first. That you can tick that one off because they were the most different. I mean, whether that is the case or not is difficult to say, but I think they were probably the two most different taxonomies to look at from a starting point. And so it's good to, that part of that work is done, and it's not fully complete, remember, because it doesn't include other objectives, it doesn't include adaptation, and it doesn't include do no significant harm. And that I'm not so sure I'm brave enough to take on a comparison of do no significant harm yet, but we'll see. My coffee has arrived, so all is well.
Excelente, excelente, Bridget. Muy bien, pues muchísimas gracias por esta respuesta y tan amplia, tan clarificadora. Ahora, regresando un poco a la región de Latinoamérica, porque sé que tenemos varias personas de la audiencia de la región, yo te quería preguntar, en la región sabemos que hay actividades pues, muy relevantes como lo que es la ganadería, la minería, que resultan de suma importancia para la economía de la región. Quería preguntar si consideras que países de la región pudieran agregar criterios nuevos relacionados con estos sectores, y de ser así, ¿cuáles serían pues, las oportunidades y retos?
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, as we often say as we look at other taxonomies and developments, and I think this is clear in the Chile roadmap, is the process of adopt where you can, adapt international criteria where you need to, and lead also where there are gaps. And I think that leadership role is really important for two reasons. One is that it creates buy-in locally. And so to see, okay, our taxonomy is creating and putting forward something into the international dialogue on taxonomies, and really is an important part. And we saw that in Colombia with the way they tackled agriculture. You know, this was a new and different way of putting forward criteria that are very important to Colombia. And you know, the EU are still debating agriculture criteria, and Colombia said, no, we can't spend 3 years debating agriculture criteria. This is very important. So I think that buy-in and that leadership role is very important for buy-in, but it's also important in filling the gaps, right? So, you know, we can't just, certain activities are not important in the EU, they're not important in China, but they are very important in Latin America. And so we need to think about how we bring these into the global taxonomy landscape. And that leadership role is very important. In mining is very difficult, and we know that. But I think the way we've been talking about it at Client Bonds, and there are not many countries yet, not many criteria yet around mining, but is to first think about what are the strategically important minerals that we need for a green economy. We know that in fossil fuel sector like coal, we need to phase that out, right? But in many other natural resources, we need all of those things for a green economy. They are an essential building block of the green economy. So in a sense, mining can be seen as an enabling activity in that way. But of course, there is significant harm in certain types of mining, in certain communities, social and environmental, and we need to reduce that and minimize that harm. So I think the real kind of challenge within the mining is to identify what are the most important minerals that we really need to support for a transition needed in batteries and all of these things. And then second, how do we make that really robust framework for avoiding harm? And I think in general terms, sometimes the do no significant harm provisions in the EU have low usability and are very difficult to implement. But I think in a sector like mining, that has to become a kind of is a really important area. And I think some of the discussion is, oh, can't we let those go away? But in mining, that would be, I say, would be a priority sector where that robustness is really important.
Maravilloso, muchas gracias, Bridget, por tu respuesta, y bueno, me alegra escuchar que la región de Latinoamérica puede tomar liderazgo y puede aportar en lo que es lecciones aprendidas de otros sectores que aún no se encuentran dentro de las taxonomías de CI o la taxonomía de la Unión Europea. Bueno, pues ya estamos llegando al final de esta conversación súper enriquecedora. Nuevamente, gracias, Bridget, por acompañarnos. Hay otras preguntas del público más relacionadas con, por ejemplo, si pueden certificarse como consultores. Les comentamos que nosotros desde CBI tenemos una lista de verificadores aprobados por CBI que tienen que pasar por todo un proceso que lo pueden encontrar. Toda esa información está en nuestra página web, al igual que mucho del material que usamos para esta presentación. La mayor parte de la información la pueden encontrar también en el idioma inglés para quien esté interesado en nuestra página web. También los invitamos a seguir nuestros podcasts, los pueden encontrar en Spotify, seguirnos en redes sociales. Y bueno, pues será un gusto vernos en una próxima ocasión en cualquier otro webinar o workshop. Y bueno, pues sin más, agradecerle a toda nuestra audiencia, agradecerte, Bridget, por compartirnos toda esta información y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Chao.
Nos vemos.